I just watched the panel discussion with Elon, Jack Dorsey, and Cathy Wood. And I know this was supposed to be a Bitcoin maximalist conference, but I'm afraid they should have called it Tell Me I Should Move to Proof of Stake Without Saying Proof of Stake Conference. Ready? Let's go. I get the impression that the purpose of this panel discussion was for Cathy Wood and Jack Dorsey to somehow corral Elon and show him the error of his ways as to his Bitcoin criticism. But it turns out that autistic billionaires with space fleets are too unpredictable, and Elon is just too smart to ever be outwitted by those two. This is the moderator. His name is Steve Lee, and he works for Jack at Square. I'm accustomed to moderators being more of a neutral party, so I don't know how well this works. But the pattern seemed to be that the moderator would try to lure Elon into expounding on his criticisms of Bitcoin. And then I got the impression that it was the job of Jack or Cathy Wood to kind of lay down the gotcha moment where they present their contrary evidence. So the first place they tried to get Elon was with his criticism of Bitcoin's inability to scale on the base layer. You already know this was the basis of the block size debate / civil war, led to a schism in the Bitcoin community, produced Bitcoin Cash and Bitcoin. And it was a big deal back in the day. I could have lived through this on all the online forums that Bitcoin people were involved in at that time. And pretty much all of us in crypto cared about this. This was like an important issue because, like we now know, it sort of determined whether Bitcoin would be used as money in day-to-day transactions or just this weird store of value thing. And let me tell you, at that time, none of us were talking about how we wanted Bitcoin to not be money for day-to-day transactions. That's what we all used it for. People paid me in Bitcoin in real life. It's interesting to note that back in 2015, we were seeing polls like this one, where the questions would be about whether or not the block size should be increased, big block versus small block. And the votes for big block were outweighing the no votes, the small block votes, by over 10-1. Despite the fact that we all thought Bitcoin was going to be money that we were going to use in our daily lives, that's why we all got on board, there was a problem. The Bitcoin code repository had to be maintained and developed by someone. And there was a team of core developers. And through this history of various people being included in that team and giving GitHub commit access and certain people getting kicked out that we won't go into right now, we've talked about it previously on this channel, there were certain core developers who became associated with certain corporate interests. And those corporate interests were intending to make money somewhere in the Bitcoin ecosystem. And a good starting place was a layer 2 for the Bitcoin network. For instance, right here, you can see if you just Google Lightning Network, which is a layer 2 for Bitcoin, you can see Lightning Network, Wikipedia, developer, Blockstream. The next question you should ask yourself is, who among the core developers was tied up with Blockstream at the time of the small block, big block debate? And I think that'll answer, for me at least, that answers a lot of questions about why we ended up with a small block Bitcoin layer 1 that basically requires a layer 2. Fortunately, Elon seems to be highly aware that the reasons we ended up with a small block size and a lower throughput, very low throughput on the base layer of Bitcoin, those reasons may not have been entirely scientific and based on sound logic. So when the moderator asked him to expand on his thoughts on scaling of layer 1 of Bitcoin, Elon didn't go back and rehash all the arguments from the block size debate. So Elon instead, he asked a pretty simple question. And it was based on his sort of physics first principles thinking that he seems to apply to everything. He said, okay, the current thought is, and I'm paraphrasing here, But the current thought is that you can't possibly go bigger. You can't possibly increase the throughput of the Bitcoin base layer because then it might make it hard for people to run full nodes, and that might decrease decentralization of the Bitcoin blockchain. We won't even get into the absurdity of this argument because we already know that while a lot of different people run full nodes around the world, the actual mining is very concentrated into a small number of hands. Elon makes a great point here. If the dangers to decentralization are so great, if you expand the block size at all, if you increase the throughput of the base layer at all, the dangers are so great and the current throughput is so acceptable, then actually people should be pushing to slow things down even more. They should decrease the block size and slow down the base layer even more. Elon laughed at the absurdity of this and it made everybody smile. But after it sunk in, we saw the nose-ringed bearded wizard kind of staring off into space and putting a rapid stroke on his beard. For her part, Cathy Wood just put the hard bite on her lower lip and the moderator just kind of grimaced. And it was almost like they all realized at once that there wasn't really a counter to the way Elon had just exposed this logical fallacy in the transition from Bitcoin as actual money used every day in transactions to this weird store of value only narrative. They obviously didn't bring Elon on so that he could invalidate the pre-ante status quo on block size and base layer throughput. Elon was even willing to add insult to injury as he further broke down these decentralization concerns that Bitcoin maximalists mentioned so much. He said, look, these parameters for the base layer were set out in 2009. At that time, there were a non-trivial number of people still accessing the internet through modems. In 2021, we've had a full decade of increases in bandwidth, and after all, your precious Bitcoin ledger is just a bunch of ASCII text. All those nodes out there, they can handle a lot more ASCII text today than they could in 2009. It only makes sense that you increase the throughput of the base layer as everybody's bandwidth increases. Their next attempted gotcha moment was on the environmental question. Elon and Tesla famously, notoriously stopped accepting Bitcoin payments and cited the negative environmental impact of Bitcoin mining. Cathy Wood cited this paper, which was a joint project between Square and Ark Invest. If you look at the disclaimer down here, it looks like Ark Invest is a holder of Square Inc. Class A common stock. So that means everybody on the call is actually involved in Square, not just Jack Dorsey and the moderator, but actually everybody but Elon. In this paper, the gist of this paper is that Bitcoin would be a driver of solar and wind increases in solar and wind generation capacity because overages in the energy produced could be used for Bitcoin mining. Elon's response was that would probably work with geothermal or hydro, but the problem with wind and solar is that they're off like half the day. And in that case, you would need batteries, something like the Tesla Powerwall, to store energy so you could actually run your Bitcoin miner 24 hours a day for efficient mining. And what was kind of left unsaid is the second you have to include a battery in this Bitcoin mining operation, this hypothetical Bitcoin mining operation, then all of a sudden you're in Elon's world and you get accused of all the same things he does that revolve around the carbon footprint of the lithium mining that's involved in creating those batteries, along with the other negative environmental externalities of all that lithium production. Elon took the rest of the panel to school on renewable energy and battery production capacity, things that he knows a lot about because of Tesla's various energy ventures. The upshot was him politely explaining that Tesla could barely get its vendors to make batteries for the cars fast enough, the implication being that it was probably going to be a while before there'd be enough battery production capacity for all these Bitcoin miners to be relying on wind and solar. Throughout this conversation, it was easy to identify the two big themes. The first was sort of the throughput versus decentralization debate. This is pretty predictable. Every blockchain, it seems, is constantly trying to solve the blockchain trilemma. How do you achieve speed, decentralization, and security all at the same time without sacrificing one? The other big theme is the energy use. What's striking about this is the timing of the conversation. If this conversation had happened 6 years ago in 2015, I think you could have watched this discussion go down. You would have thought, hey, these are great minds in blockchain, all discussing some cutting edge topics. This is going to be the very most cutting edge thought on this topic. However, if you're in 2021 and you're not a maximalist of Bitcoin or Ethereum 1.0, you're aware that proof of stake exists. And it turns out proof of stake maybe has already solved the blockchain trilemma. If you look at modern proof of stake Gen 3 blockchains like Cardano, they seem to have achieved security. Ouroboros hasn't gotten hacked. They seem to have achieved speed. The base layer is much, 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 much faster than Bitcoin, and we've got Hydra for layer 2. Once we have to resort to layer 2 for possibly infinite scaling, and we've got decentralization. If you look at the Bitcoin blockchain, the mining is done by a handful of miners. More on that later. And in Cardano, we've got over 2,600 different mining pools. We also know that Cardano uses a tiny fraction of the energy used by the Bitcoin blockchain. So it's a little bit of a straw man argument to say that the Bitcoin blockchain is going to move to renewable energy. Even if, despite Elon's very polite warnings that they couldn't possibly source enough batteries fast enough, even if they were able to get all of the Bitcoin miners on solar and wind, or as Bitcoin tried to as Elon tried to redirect them toward hydro or geothermal or nuclear, even if they got on renewable energy of some type, you have to ask yourself the question, wouldn't it just be better to go to proof of stake and take that same renewable energy and put it somewhere else, like in transportation, like Elon's trying to do? Even though Cardano is already incredibly more decentralized than Bitcoin, if we check the actual number, it looks like adapools.org says it's over 2,800, almost 2,900 right now. Even that wasn't enough for Cardano. Today, we saw Cardano drop the Conclave paper. Its title is Conclave, a collective stake pool protocol. This paper lays out some pretty interesting stats. It says the carbon footprint of a single Bitcoin transaction is equivalent to 1.2 million Visa transactions. That definitely doesn't sound like the money that's going to free the world. If it's 1.2 million times less efficient in terms of carbon production than Visa. They also say that the total Bitcoin network is comparable to Sweden. I'm guessing that, in terms of carbon footprint, we already kind of knew that. The countries keep getting bigger. I think the first one I heard was that it was the same size as Iceland or something like that. Now it's getting bigger. I hear bigger countries like Sweden, and I think I've heard people compare it to Argentina. We also see in another footnote on the second page, 86% of Bitcoin's hashing power and 83% of Ethereum's hashing power are controlled by 5 entities each. Coming back to ADA pools, we can see that the top 5 entities in Cardano only control something on the order of 26.4%. Like I said, Cardano wasn't satisfied even with that. This new Conclave paper lays out a framework for parties to get together and form these conclaves, which are a sort of collective stake pool with no single operator. There'd be no single authority running the stake pool. The stake pool will be run by everybody participating in the staking. So even though we have this incredible 2,800, almost 2,900 stake pools under this conclave system, each of those 2,800 stake pools itself could be decentralized. So we wouldn't have 2,800 operators. I know that number's wrong because we have some multiple stake pool operators. We could have 2,800 stake pools with myriad people inside each stake pool actually controlling the stake pool. Even though the unwritten law at these Bitcoin maximalist conferences seems to be at best to pretend like proof of stake doesn't exist, or at worst to heavily vilify it, it's getting harder and harder to make a case that proof of stake isn't better on each leg of the blockchain trilemma. We know that it's more distributed. It's more distributed right now. It's more decentralized right now. Right now, the block validation in Cardano is much, much more decentralized than in either Ethereum or in Bitcoin. It's also faster. Proof of stake has proven itself to be much, much faster. Go ahead and make a Bitcoin transaction on the base layer and make a Cardano transaction on the base layer and tell me which one settles faster. We can't even make a case that there's greater security with proof of work. Ouroboros hasn't been hacked. We haven't had a problem so far. It's been around for a while. It's a gigantic bug bounty. Anybody who could hack Ouroboros has 37 billion in market cap up for grabs, but it hasn't happened. It hasn't happened. If there was a serious security risk, it hasn't happened so far. It hasn't materialized, and it's not looking like it is going to materialize. Meanwhile, the Bitcoin maximalists over here have worked themselves into these corners where the only way to solve their low throughput problems is to create centralized points of failure in their layer 2 solution. And the only way to solve their energy consumption problems is to become reliant on the already undersupplied global lithium mining capacity. This kind of thinking all results from bounded rationality, with the boundary being that crypto has to be proof of work. But once you cross that Rubicon, watching these kind of discussions truly becomes equivalent to a game of tell me I should move to proof of stake without saying proof of stake. And if you're going to go to proof of stake, it should probably be Cardano. You know you're winning when your competitors are constantly making the case for you. Talk to you tomorrow.